Good afternoon, students. Father Logue here. I am your Monday mystery reader, and today we're going to be reading a book that I've already read to the first graders, so they've heard this one before, but I think it's worth hearing again. So the book is called The Weight of a Mass, and it has some really beautiful illustrations there, so we'll be showing those as well. All right, so let's get started. Right inside the cover there's a nice piece of artwork that's worth showing. And we'll begin with our story. The Weight of a Mass. Once upon a time, a king betrothed to a queen from a faraway land consented to be married in a cathedral, even though he knew that only a handful of old women would attend the Holy Mass. It was not that his subjects wished the royal couple ill, or that they would not find their own ways of celebrating the union, but the king's people had grown cold and careless in the practice of their faith. A while before the ceremony, a ragged old widow shuffled into the kingdom's most prosperous bake shop. Subjects soaring in high spirits and decked in finery whisked past her, carrying away the finest confections and loaves of bread. The baker lifted elegant pastries and arranged them in lacy boxes upon which he tied jaunty bows. His son, a kindly boy, guarded the royal wedding cake from children's probing fingers, all the while describing how he and his father had erected it. Finally, it was the widow's turn in the crowded shop. "For the love of God," she begged the baker, "if you will give me a crust of stale bread, I will offer my Mass tonight for you." The baker's son spun on his heels to fetch the bread reserved for children who fed the royal swans, but his father growled, "This woman shares the disease from which you suffer, and your mother before you. If I didn't keep you busy here, I'd find you on your knees in church with the likes of her." And so this woman wants to offer her Mass. She's going to go to Mass and pray for the baker. And she says, "Can I please have some bread in return for that?" And he's not very happy to do that. A hush fell over the crowd. The baker peered over the counter. "You propose to hear a Mass for me?" he challenged the old woman. "I'd rather hear the jingle of your coins." "But I haven't a shilling," the woman whispered. "Then I haven't the bread," the baker shot back. "Father," the son protested, "she asked in the name of God." "Then let God provide her bread," the baker exclaimed. The widow turned to leave, but the baker had not finished taunting her. "Let us see how much bread I would owe you," he said. He tore a tiny corner off his finest tissue paper and read aloud as he formed two minuscule words, "One Mass." And you can see there on the little piece of paper, it's a little blurry, but he's writing "One Mass." Because in the bake shops a long time ago, they would have scales that would hold one thing on each side, and you would put coins in one side, and they would weigh as much as the food that you could buy. And so he's saying, you don't have any coins, so I'll put this one little slip of paper in this side, and we'll see how much bread that's worth. He's expecting it won't be very much, because it's just a little piece of paper, right? The baker held up the tiny piece of paper, and with a ceremonious flair, he laid the wispy scrap onto the resting tray of his brass scale. Then he flicked a slice of old bread onto the other tray. He blinked, confused. The bread side had not dropped to lift the lighter paper. You see the side with the paper is lower than the bread, even though the bread should be heavier, right? Impossible, the baker exclaimed, placing a marzipan apple onto the bread's side. Still the tray holding the paper stayed down. The baker piled layered cake onto the tray, but this did not tip the scale. He stacked his best cherry-topped cupcakes onto the balance, but they did not make the difference. Brushing past his son, he swept heavy filled chocolates into a box. Still the scale did not budge when he placed those on it too. He arranged a dozen poppy seed cakes and 24 rolls onto the pile. "The paper outweighs his goods," a man exclaimed. So the baker's getting a little desperate to tip the scales there, but you can see the paper's still heavier than all those goods. The Royal Council of Weights and Measures tested this scale just last week, the baker protested. Something's gone wrong with it. And so he's saying the scale must be broken, right? The baker's son lifted the tiny scrap of paper off the scale, and a gasp went up as the baked goods crashed down with a jangle. Everyone began to speak at once. "What can this mean?" they asked each other. The crowd quieted to watch as the baker emptied the heavy tray and tested the scale with all his weights, even those smaller than a game piece. The scale responded to every change, floating up and down. "The scale is correct," a woman exclaimed. "Of course it is correct," the baker bellowed. "I'm an honest man." So there he is testing the scale, making sure it's working properly. Compelled by the event, clients rushed to the doors, calling in more witnesses from the streets. The baker addressed his son, "Pile it high. This time turn the scale around so the trays are switched." The breads and buns, candies and cakes brought their side down with a satisfying thud. "Now," the baker said, as he let the snippet of paper float down toward the new tray, "we'll see the truth." So now he's switched it around and he stacked up all the goods and he's dropping the one little piece of paper into the other side of the tray. No sooner did the tissue touch the shiny brass tray than it lifted up the opposite side. "But I don't understand," the baker muttered as he ran to fetch his freshest donuts. He piled on fruit cakes and cream cakes, berry tarts and poached pears. "This can't be," he cried as he plastered on plum pudding and candied fruits, almond confetti and crushed walnuts. "The mass intention weighs more than these," the baker's son marveled. Here comes the baker down the stairs with all his donuts, everything he can pile onto that scale. The baker was beside himself with bewilderment. He turned to his son. "Don't think I don't know that you would abandon the baking trade to become a priest," he warned. "And don't think any of this will influence me." He took a deep breath. "Bring me the royal wedding cake." As the baker's son rolled the cake's cart through the crowd, it parted, respectful lest the prized confection get damaged. And so this is the royal wedding cake. Remember, there's going to be a big wedding between the king and the queen. This is probably the heaviest thing they have in their shop. On the count of 3, the baker ordered his son, "Help me get it onto the scale. This will put an end to the nonsense." 1, 2, 3. The wedding cake teetered on top of the pile. The paper on which the baker had written the words "one mass" hadn't even fluttered. The baker and his clients stood dumbfounded. So they tossed the whole cake on top of the pile of baked goods, and the scale didn't move. Just then the cathedral bell began tolling the call to the royal wedding mass. The baker's son stood over the piece of paper staring at it. When he lifted it from the scale, hands surged forward to rescue the wedding cake as things beneath it came crashing down with a weighty clang. A man went out into the street and took up the Ave Maria. The bells were tolling. Other clients, who had intended to celebrate the royal wedding in diverse ways, now filed out and processed towards the kingdom's great cathedral. One by one, they joined the masculine voice in raising the lofty hymn. So here they are trying to catch the wedding cake, and the baker's son picking up the piece of paper. The stunned baker saw that the only customer left in his shop was the old widow. He made a gesture of putting everything at her disposal. "Come every day," he told her. "You will never go hungry again." The widow smiled and tucked only a thin slice of bread into her pocket. As the baker watched his son unbutton his white apron, the father sensed that, one day, the boy would be exchanging it for a white collar. So here they are, the last 3 people in the baker's shop. The baker, his son, and the widow trailed the procession to the cathedral to offer Mass with their monarchs. Amidst the singing and exclamations of wonder and joy, the baker asked the old lady, "Why did you only take a slice when you could have taken anything and everything in my shop?" "I was ashamed to take more," the widow told him. "Ashamed?" the baker asked. "But it was you who believed in God's power while the rest of us had grown cold." "I was ashamed," the widow explained, "because even though I have never given up going to Mass, I asked you only for a crust of stale bread in exchange for it." You see, my friends, like you, I too do not know the weight of a Mass. And remember, I showed you the artwork at the beginning, the first page, and here it is again, the very last page. The cathedral is now full of people, and you can see somewhere here, I think over here, the widow and the baker and the baker's son. And now, the end. And now I've heard this story years ago, the first time, and what's amazing about it is that it's a true story, and it's based on a true story. So the original story came from Luxembourg, which is a country in Europe, and it was between a butcher and a captain of the forest guards. They were in the butcher shop, and an old woman entered and was begging for a small piece of meat, for some food. But when the butcher scoffed at her, she offered to hear Holy Mass in exchange for the food. And as the author writes in the back here, the events that transpired then were very similar to what happens in our own story here, which I have set instead in a bakery. And as a result of that miracle, the captain began attending Mass every day, and one of his sons later received the calling to be a priest. And that son that priest is the one who told the story to the author of this book. So while it took place in a butcher shop, not a baker shop, the rest of the events are pretty much as described in here. And I think it's an important story to remember, especially in these days, when we don't have that opportunity to be physically present at Mass, to even more seriously unite ourselves to that gift, because we see the baker and his son and all these people who had drifted away from God and from the Mass didn't recognize the value of it. But even the old woman in the end, she said, when she said she only took a piece of bread when the baker offered her anything, because she was ashamed that she only asked for a piece of bread in return for the Mass. So she said, even I didn't fully realize the value of it. And I think that's something that can be all the more reinforced now that we're separated from it, to recognize the true value of the gift that we have at our disposal all the time, usually. But now we have to have that longing for it. So it was an honor to be your mystery reader. You guys are in our prayers, especially every day as we celebrate the Mass. and I will see you next time. God bless. Bye.